Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a conversation where good thoughts help renew the mind with the Word of God. I'm Charlie Carter, and I'm here with Tim Little and Andy Stearns. Let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a wonderful duet of an episode with myself, Charlie, and Dr. Tim Little.
Whatever name you want to use.
I was trying to come up with something other than Dr. Little, and
You could call me by my Hebrew name. I don't know if you know my Hebrew name.
I don't know your Hebrew name.
That's okay. Let's just move on.
Ooh, tease. What's Tim's Hebrew name? All right, so here is what we're going to do in this episode. I have already introduced the episode.
Congratulations. Well done.
Perfect. For announcements, we just have Andy's Weekly Wisdom, which will be from Certeange coming up in a moment. We are going to have two little tidbits of listener feedback, one in which we're going to go back and answer a question that was raised a while ago by, I believe, Caleb Lobb about golden calves. And no, we're not talking about someone who's really fit. And number two, we have an email. Yeah, like a golden calf.
I got it.
Yeah.
It took a little bit.
Yeah. There's actually, no, we're not going to say that.
Keep going.
I know someone who refers to themselves like as their gamer tag as the golden calf, but we won't get into that. And then we have another email that came in this week from Isaiah Hawk that we're gonna tease that we're gonna talk about that at a later episode. So hopefully that teases you. Anyway, from there we're gonna get to books and business, where we mention what we've been reading and working on. The main content of the episode, we're going to go back to, that's another listener feedback. Randy Vodder sent us
that's what you're interacting with.
Yeah, an article about C.S. Lewis. And let me pull that up again. What was it? I should, a good host would have already pulled this up, but the article's name was 5 Cardinal Rules on Living a Good Life by not by C.S. Lewis. About C.S. Lewis by Thomas something. But we're going to talk about that during our episode, and then we're going to close the episode with a devotion in Exodus 32-ish, which is fitting as we talk about golden calves here in a moment. And here's Charlie's homemade sound effect. Whoosh. Announcements. Andy's Weekly Wisdom.
You're horrendous.
Yeah, I know. At some point, I'll get a little bit more post-production, but for now, it's handmade. Whoosh. So, we're moving on in Certeange to a new section, and we had been in a section about, let's see here, it was the cultivation of necessary contacts, where, he's talked about your fellows, he's talked about your fools.
Oh yeah, you had that weird one about the wife.
Yeah, well, there's the wife who kind of curates the context of the home, and then, well, you sometimes have to deal with fools. And last week we talked about, he was debating, like, how do you interact with people that you don't necessarily have as an intellectual contact? And he's like, you know what, sometimes your silence is better than actually interacting with these people. And then from there, in the same chapter on the organization of the intellectual's life, the next section is safeguarding the necessary element of action. And what he calls is action, like doing things.
Right.
And he says this, that, and I'm just gonna read a couple of paragraphs here.
I think 2 paragraphs.
3.
Oh my.
And what he does is he contrasts the intellectual life, which is mindish, it's thinking,
right,
to action, like going and doing physical things.
I think I remember what this is about.
So here's what he says.
He says it's okay to sit in the chair and chill out for a while you're thinking. You don't have to be doing and producing things all the time.
Well, not necessarily producing in the sense of like writing, but like being active, like doing like physical things. Anyway, the intellectual vocation, strictly considered, is contrary to that of action. The contemplative life and the active life have always been contrasted as springing from contrary thoughts and aspirations. Contemplation gathers in, action gives out. The one seeks for light, the other longs to bestow its possessions on others. Speaking generally, we must evidently resign ourselves to this division of tasks, being glad, each of us, to praise what we do not do, to love and appreciate its fruit in others, thanks to the communion of souls. So some of us have a contemplative life, some of us don't.
Somebody's got to go bring in the crops.
Exactly. Here's where I think the value in about what he's about to say. But real life, I think emphasis on real life does not admit of such a strict separation. Duty may force us into action, as a moment ago we saw it might into the society of our fellows. So sometimes you can't avoid interacting with people that you maybe wouldn't have chosen to interact with.
Sure.
You also can't just get away from action in life.
Sure.
Sometimes there's things you have to do. Action, or I'll finish the statement there. Sometimes we might fall into the society of those fellows, and the same principles apply with action. Action regulated by conscience prepares conscience itself for the rules of truth, disposes it for recollection when the time comes, unites it to providence, which is also a source of truth. That's just kind of wordy there. But what I liked is the very end of it. Thought and action have the same Father. Capital F. That's where he mentioned providence earlier, and he capitalized that as well. And his point is, sure, if you want to be an intellectual, that's your life, you're going to spend a lot of time sitting, gathering in light, reading, contemplating, and you might have a disproportionate amount of that to your action. That doesn't mean you don't have action.
Right.
And when there are things that come into your life that require
doing
action, that's also from your Father.
Right.
And doing the things that you should do, acting when you need to act, is not in discord to the life of the mind. He actually hinted it in there, and it's most of what the rest of the chapter is about, is that acting when you're supposed to act helps you think when you're supposed to think.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just like that I like that whole page of recognizing that the life of the mind as a goal sometimes has things that cause it to cease. And there's it's good and right for that to happen. And so that last quote, I'll read it one more time as a cap. Thought and action have the same Father.
Mm-hmm.
Like that quote. Moving on.
Books and business.
Not quite yet.
Oh, what
Whoosh.
we had.
We've got some listener feedback. So let's first go back to Caleb Love. He had asked a question about, and let me see if I can pull that
I've got it up here.
You've got it. Okay, so you want to read his question about the golden calf and then get into our answers?
Sure. In 1 Kings 12, 2 Chronicles 11, Jeroboam sets up 2 golden calves for the people to worship so that they don't go to Jerusalem. Most commentaries say that these were most likely not made to be gods to worship, but rather a tool or aid to help worship God, like the true God. But he didn't really see that in the text. It seems like the opposite is the case, where they are literally worshiping like gods, false gods. So what Caleb is interacting with here, it began back in Exodus 32, where they make the first golden calf. And I'm going to read through Exodus 32, beginning in verse 2. Well, we'll begin at verse 1. Now, when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Okay, so what do they request? They want Aaron to make them gods, lowercase g, okay? Verse 2, and Aaron said to them, "Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he received the gold from their hand, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made a molded calf. Then they said, "This is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt." Okay, this is your God, lowercase g. that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now, verse 5. So when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And that is the Lord's personal name. It is not a God, Lord G. It is not God's. It is simply, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Then they rose on the next day, offered burnt offerings. What does that sound like? And brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. So you have here in this text the construction of gods, a calf, and then the worship of the one true God, Yahweh. And there's a conflation between these two ideas. So some have surmised that the God itself, the image itself was not worshipped, but the divine presence of Yahweh, the true God of Israel, was worshipped, and his presence was above the image. That's what some have surmised. Others have surmised that Moses or Aaron simply made an image that then represented the true God, Yahweh, which is, of course, in breaking the first commandment or the second commandment, depending on what list you use. What exactly is going on here seems to be similar to what's going on with Jeroboam. Because you have the construction of a cow, a calf, and with Jeroboam there are two of them, it seems to be an outright rejection of the worship of Yahweh would have led to a riot within the northern kingdom of Israel during the days of Jeremiah. So many scholars have read this text, Exodus 32. This was a syncretistic worship of the one true God. And they've read that same scenario into 1 Kings 12 and 2 Chronicles 11, where Jeroboam was similarly, just like Aaron, saying, come and worship the Lord at these two places of worship, symbolized in the worship of the calf. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think the key word you mentioned there, syncretism.
Yes.
So it's not an outright denial, but it's worshiping the right God, capital G, through methods that he did not prescribe or would not have prescribed for them. And the thought that popped into my mind, because we're in Exodus 32, has Moses come down yet with the tablets?
He does that right after this, and he breaks them.
Yeah. So, you mentioned the second commandment, like we're talking about the 10 commandments here.
Right.
Like, no graven image.
But those were already given in Exodus 20. So they did have
Okay. Thank you.
There was a portion of the law that was already given.
That's where that I was trying to clarify in my mind, like, where are we there? So they had heard.
Yes. We're
not supposed to make images of the Lord. But it doesn't seem like, Aaron is indicating that's what he's trying to do. Like this golden calf, he doesn't think he's picturing the Lord here, but it is some interesting syncretism of worship that is certainly wasn't prescribed by the Lord himself, most likely.
Most likely.
Most
definitely.
Like yeah, 100%. Like, I would be shocked if we found some manuscript tomorrow that's like, and when you worship me, please make a golden cow. Like, that just is not quite what we would expect.
I was just helping you out, man, clarifying.
Yeah.
So when Aaron's accounting of the details later on, he said, the people said to me, make us gods that shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And I said to them, whoever has any gold. Okay, now when Moses saw that the people were unrestrained, then he went and sent off a bunch of people to go kill them. And they killed like 3,000 people. So Moses's accounting of it is a little bit different. And so some scholars are like, Moses seems to cave to the pressure of the people. And he's like, well, they're going to kill me. They're going to do this anyway. But a lot of that is not in the text. We are kind of reading between the lines. What the text focuses on is that Aaron does what the people say. Then it seems almost like he's connecting it still to Yahweh worship, the worship of the one true God. So is there like, he doesn't want to go all the way? but he then advocates for some syncretistic religion or something. So we aren't. I mean, you can study through the text for yourself, but the images themselves, Aaron connects to the one true God.
Yeah.
And so that's why you have the Jeroboam scenario. And I think that the big message has to do with syncretism and how God demands pure worship in the manner, not just in word, but in practice and in deed and in the way that he commands, which is something that we need to take seriously as 21st century Christians.
Yeah. And we'll move on. But what's interesting to me is, if they are presenting the calf in a sense like this is the pillar of fire or he's above it.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is while they're doing that, the Lord is clearly not there, because where is the Lord?
Up on the mountain.
He's on the mountain with Moses.
Yeah. No, you've highlighted actually a point that other commentators have noted as well. Yeah. God has appeared to them in these very theophanic ways. And now what have they done? They made this dumb molten image to represent him. I was like, how lame is that? And then in Exodus 34, Moses puts his tabernacle outside, and guess what God does? God comes and talks to Moses like face to face. Yeah. So it just highlights the abominable practice of trying to depict God by some stupid image.
Yeah. And, at some point when this book I'm working on is actually finished, there's a huge point we draw from this as New Testament believers that Paul makes in 2 Corinthians, which is there is evidence when you've been in the presence of God. And he points at Moses in Exodus 34 and says, look, he's in the presence of God and he came down from the mountain and his face was shining. And that was like the law. You now have the Holy Spirit indwelling you. Shouldn't you have some glory that far surpasses it? Yes. But anyway, that's not the point. But it's, here they are worshiping this calf, and clearly nothing's happening. The presence of God's not even there. And Moses comes down and his face is shining.
Yeah.
And they look at that. They look at the evidence of the presence of God and told Moses to cover it up.
Right.
And so it's funny to me that you have this quote unquote worship happening.
Right.
And they're just so averse to the actual presence of God.
Yeah.
But anyway, great answer, Tim. Gladly defer to your expertise in the Old Testament. And as if I have some expertise somewhere else, but don't really. So the other question that we're going to tease is from Isaiah, and I pulled it up. Where is the tab? There we go. And we're not going to answer this one today, but we liked it, and we're going to answer it maybe on next week's episode. And while I pull that up here, I'm just going to remind you, Tim, did you know that we have a Thinklings Gmail that literally any one of our listeners who's listening to this right now, they could email us at thinklingspodcast@gmail.com with any comment or question, and we would mention it on the air? Did you know that?
Well, maybe not anything, but
yeah,
most anything.
Most anything. It's like the question when I was like, maybe God didn't prescribe that. I'm pretty sure. And it's like, no, we're pretty sure. Yeah. So there's essentially nothing you could send that we wouldn't mention on air. And anyway, so Isaiah did that. He emailed us, and here's his question. Here's the subject line: creativity and walking in the Spirit, which already piqued my interest. So here's the question. Is there a contrast between finding joy in creative work, like writing, thinking, drawing, or aesthetic things, mindish things? Is there a contrast between those and finding delight in the law of the Lord? So, and in parentheses, he has Psalm 1. And in prayer, in the law of the Lord and in prayer. Do these coincide? Do they coincide? That's a great question. And it's a question that targets the ordering of our affections. And we're going to address that on a future episode, but wanted to throw the question out there that all the listeners hearing that, maybe you can think through, you know, the things I enjoy to do in life, the things that God has asked me to love. What to quote Lewis, is there a concord of the depth and height? Anyway, but we're going to answer that on a future episode. So thank you, Isaiah, for emailing that into us. And if anyone else wants to email us something, we would love to have an email from you. And with that, we're on to that thing we always do.
Books and business.
Let's talk about some books. So I haven't really been reading anything new. I have obviously read the article that we're going to address in the episode. And then it's kind of the same old, same old. The only thing that I've been working on that is a little bit new-ish is I'm building an online class. And that is Christian Experience, which is, I took that class 12 years ago in spring of 2011. And it was taught by a friend of the podcast, Dr. Jeff Newman. And it is now taught in person by none other than Thinklings Stearns. And so I get to join the party. Here's the house that Dr. Newman built, which is Christian Experience. And I live in the upstairs and Andy lives in the downstairs. He teaches the in-person class and I'm going to teach the online out in the cloud class. And so all that to say, in preparation for that, I went back and found my notes from when I took that class and was just blessed to go back through that material, to think back through those things, and then even read my thoughts on what Dr. Newman was presenting to me 12 years ago. And so that's really the only new thing that I've been reading and processing through and writing about in preparation for the class. And just give a plug, like, if you don't think taking notes is valuable, if your pastor right now is going through a sermon series and you write down some points on that text and you organize it in a way that you can look back at it, you could legitimately, years from now, be studying through that passage and pull up those notes and they could be a blessing to you. And so, anyway, that's really the only things that I've been reading and working on.
So I'm still working through Christ in the Old Testament, 5 views. I've made it through Golden Gate and Longman's views. I was supposed to have this done by today, but I got a 1-week extension because my meeting got postponed. Yes. So that allowed me to procrastinate even further. So anyway.
And Tim is a human like the rest of us.
So Golden Gate, which by the way, so far I have been very unimpressed with the views presented, and I think I'm not going to like any of them. So 5 views on Christ in the Old Testament. View number 1, talking about John Golden Gate, his view. He's postmodern, and that comes through in his article. I've read a lot of stuff by John Golden Gate. He's a well-known Old Testament scholar. His Isaiah commentary is one of the best. I greatly appreciated it. He's also got, I think, one of the best Old Testament theologies. So I'm very familiar with this author. This one paragraph, he talks about his view of inspiration. I'm going to read the paragraph. Paul's description of the scriptures as God-breathed has a complementary implication. The implication of the scriptures being God-breathed does not simply mean that the prophecies are infallible and inerrant, though they are. He says that they are, which I thought was interesting because I didn't think he believed in inerrancy, but whatever. Other New Testament references to the Holy Spirit's involvement with the scriptures relate this involvement to their extraordinary capacity to say further things to people other than the audience that they originally addressed. Isn't that interesting? So what does it mean to be God-breathed? It speaks beyond its original audience to succeeding generations. That's his interpretation. It's relevant
in ways that the original audience would have never known.
Yes.
Or could have comprehended.
Which, what did I say? He is what kind of a...
Postmodern.
He's postmodern.
Which makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense. And
because that's how every modern or postmodern wants documents to be understood.
Right.
They're relevant because they're relative.
Yep. So now I'm going to flip over to Tremper Longman, and he talks about his hermeneutics. And he states, I think it is correct to speak of a deeper meaning of a text, and then he has in parentheses, sensus plenior, one of which the human author would not have been consciously aware. So he's going to interpret the text in ways that is going to fall outside of the New Testament authors can put a meaning back into the text that was not there in the original document, because he believes in sensus plenior. So those are the first two views, and both of those scholars take the Old Testament seriously, for which I'm grateful. For example, John Goldingay, I've mentioned him and how I've liked some of his writings. The reason, which is kind of weird to say I like this postmodern guy, but he often will leave the text alone and just interpret it in light of its original context, which is helpful for me. And he makes good observations many times. He's off on Isaiah 42, but in the text that they go through Genesis 22 and Proverbs 8, and I liked what he had to say. I'm like, this sounds pretty close to my position. And his exegesis of those texts. I think as I go through the book, I'm going to find greater disagreement with some of the succeeding authors, because Longman, he's going to do a sensus plenior thing with Proverbs 8, and I'm just not going to like it. So all that to say, what book might I recommend on a topic like Christ in the Old Testament? Well, The Messiah in the Old Testament by Walter Kaiser. He would argue for the single unified meaning of the passage, which is, that view is not presented in this book. And our listeners need to, and it's just so, I'm just shocked.
They have a 5 used book and they don't have that?
And that one's not in there. I know. That was really disturbing to me.
Use your word, Tim. That's horrendous.
There we go. So anyway, Messiah in the Old Testament by Walter Kaiser. If I was going to read something on this topic, that one would definitely float to the top of the list, and I would encourage you to read that one alongside of the 5 Views book here. Boom. Yeah. That's my book for books and business for now.
And to just give a plug again, I know I've mentioned this, we've mentioned this book before, but in Principles of Bible Teaching, which you could take that class online, you could even audit it from me if you want to. We read Kaiser's
Toward an
Exegetical Theology, where he gives, I think, it's a little dated. It's in the 80s, but at the time he gives a wonderful definition and history of exegesis. He tells you what interpretation is, and I think gives a great overview of the text is what the author
intended. Yeah, authorial intent.
You can't just do what you want.
Right.
And so that is, to me, standard reading in that class. And admittedly, for the sophomore level, it's probably a little much. Like when he gets into his history of interpretation, and he's talking about the German, postmoderns. He's talking about Gadamer and
Goldingay even brings it up, and he mentions Kaiser and E.D. Hirsch, validity and interpretation. There's a whole big conversation here outside of these Christian evangelical authors, but yeah.
Hirsch, and then
Gadamer.
Well, what's the other big one? Van Hooser has a big book on the topic, but anyway, that's not why we're here. But if you want a good book on that, Toward an Exegetical Theology by Kaiser, who Greg Kokel, friend of the podcast, famously said, "Towards what?" If you remember that. But anyway, so here's what we're going to do in this episode. We had an article sent to us from Randy Vodder, friend of our podcast out in Colorado. And the link is it's medium.com. It's a personal growth article, 5 Cardinal Rules on Living a Good Life by C.S. Lewis. These are C.S. Lewis's 5 rules. And this guy is going to give us some ideas from some quotes about Lewis. And so we're just going to walk through. I enjoyed reading it. It's a quick read.
Sure.
I mean, it's almost so quick that I wonder if someone just could have gone to ChatGPT and said, "Hey, AI, can you write me an article based on C.S. Lewis?" And it's just there's almost nothing to it, but because it has C.S. Lewis's name, I think it has some notoriety. Anyway, so we're going to just walk through the 5 points of the
Let's do
article
it.
and see what we think about them.
Mhm.
So, point number 1, he gives a brief introduction. We have the 5 cardinal rules on living a good life. Let go of the idea that life should be completely smooth and uninterrupted. He gives a brief introduction on who Lewis is, and here's point number 1. 1, for the complete experience, embrace life through active living and engagement. And here's the quote from C.S. Lewis. Life is too deep for words, so don't try to describe it, just live it. Okay. So before I say anything else, Tim, what do you think about that point and that idea?
Life is too deep for words, so don't try to describe it, just live it.
Yeah.
I don't know, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah. And does
Life
it seem like that's something that maybe like you're a little surprised Lewis, who's like a quite accomplished author, would say?
It sounds a little bit, I don't know. Did you find something that it's not him that wrote it?
Well, hold on. We'll hold on to that for a moment. So, this goes well with the quote from Sertange, like someone who has the life of the mind. You have mind things, you have active things. And here's Lewis like, you know what? Life's too short, go live your life out there. And so what do you think about that, Tim?
I don't know what he means by it. I need to get a little bit more information there.
You need some context, right?
I need some context.
Okay,
yeah.
well,
it sounds very postmodern. It can mean a lot of different things.
Hold on to that thought about context. We will come back to that later as we critique or commend this article. Just taking it at face value, I guess I don't have a problem with it at face value. And what it sounded similar to me was something from one of his buddies. And so this is a quote from Gandalf. Now, this is from the movie The Hobbit. I have the cross-reference from the book that is similar.
Ooh.
But here's something Gandalf says. So
Let's hear it.
Tolkien, Lewis's friend. Gandalf says this to Bilbo at the beginning of The Hobbit. You've been sitting quietly for far too long. Tell me, when did doilies in your mother's dishes become so important to you? I remember a young hobbit who was always running off in search of elves in the woods, who would stay out late, come home after dark trailing mud and twigs and fireflies. A young hobbit who would have liked nothing better than to find out what was beyond the borders of the Shire. And then here's the quote that's snappy. The world is not in your books and maps. It's out there. Gandalf tells Bilbo that.
Okay, life is too deep for words, so don't try to describe it, just live it. You need to move beyond the books and reading. And so you need to go live.
Bilbo, stop hanging out in the Shire. Yeah. Go adventure.
Quit reading about other people's lives. You need to go live your own life.
It's like a wanderlust type of a thing.
That makes sense a little bit more.
Now, to be fair, none of that quote.
Right, that was Tolkien.
None of that quote from, well, that's kind of Tolkien. None of that quote I just read is actually in the book that Tolkien wrote. That's in the movie. So a Peter Jackson adaptation. But to kind of communicate similarly, here is what Tolkien actually wrote. So this is a quote from The Hobbit.
Okay.
Describing Bilbo.
Goodness, look at you. Holy smokes.
Oh yeah, dude, I got into this one.
You evidently did.
It's a content baby. So here's a line from the book The Hobbit, seemingly discussing a similar idea about Bilbo. As the dwarves sang The Hobbit, sang The Hobbit, there should be a comma there. So this is a similar point in the book. So the dwarves come to Bilbo. They're trying to get him to go on this adventure. He doesn't really want to go. Okay. So as the dwarves sang, the hobbit felt the love of beautiful things made by hands and by cunning and by magic moving through him, a fierce and jealous love, the desire of the hearts of the dwarves. So as they sing about Erebor, the kingdom under the mountain, They sing about their long-lost home. Bilbo is moved.
Mm.
Then something tookish woke up inside of him. So you're
Ooh.
fool of a took?
Yep.
Okay. Something tookish woke up inside him, and he wished to go and see the great mountains and hear the pine trees and the waterfalls and explore the caves and hear a sword instead of a walking stick. He looked out the window. The stars were out in a dark sky above the trees. He's looking at those stars. Here's the line. This is beautiful.
Oh, here it is.
He thought of the jewels of the dwarves shining in dark caverns. Suddenly, in the wood beyond the water, a flame leapt up, probably something lighting a wood fire. And he thought of plundering dragons, settling on his quiet hill and kindling it all to flames.
Fear.
He shuddered, and very quickly he was playing Mr. Baggins of Bag End Underhill again. So, what actually happens to Bilbo?
Well, he visualizes, he imagines both the beauty and wonder of the dwarves and elves, but also the terror of the dragon.
And so I would actually say what the movie presents is maybe just slightly incorrect.
Sure.
It's not that he's just some curmudgeon. He never wants to leave home. He's a homebody. Uh-huh. It's not that he doesn't have, like, I think he does appreciate beauty and adventure and things like that. But quite literally, he has been tasked with sneaking under the nose of a dragon,
sure.
and he realizes that he's going to probably get killed.
Sure.
And that's what makes him want to stay home. Now, so what do we think about the idea? Is life in books? Is life lived? Obviously there's a balance between the two, which our quote today beautifully talked about.
Yeah, it did.
There's times when you go and you steal from a dragon. There's times when you come home and you write about it in a big red book that becomes a famous bestseller. Okay. Bilbo, much like Lewis, was an author. He obviously didn't believe life is outside of books.
Sure.
He crafted worlds on a page.
Sure.
I don't think the author of the article is maybe understanding Lewis there.
So you don't think so? Oh, you didn't.
I don't think
he misunderstood Lewis.
I certainly don't think he's advocating for reckless abandon of the life of the mind. Like, go live your life. Certainly, Lewis was going to be balanced there.
Uh-huh.
And we don't see presented any balance. Now, do I not like the idea? Like, 5 cardinal rules for life. Life's not in books. Go live it. I would, well, if you're being hyperbolic, you're wrong. Because you can't, just like you can't separate action from your mind, you can't separate mind from action. And if you ignore the life of the mind, that's not a cardinal rule to live by. So don't really like rule number 1.
Yeah, so he may have misrepresented Lewis there, because Lewis wouldn't have advocated people to not read.
Exactly. Now, if he would have given some context and some balance, I don't have a problem with the idea. But in a hyperbolic sense, yeah. Okay, so number 2. I got to get to the right tab. Number 2, let go of the idea that life should be completely smooth and uninterrupted. Here's the quote from Lewis. We must stop regarding unpleasant or unexpected things as interruptions of real life. The truth is that interruptions are real life. At face value, what do you think?
I kind of like this one. Let go of the idea that life should be completely smooth and uninterrupted. That's his point. So a completely smooth life is what a lot of people like. In fact, I was interacting with somebody who had read our book, and I think they misunderstood that we are advocating the successful love of following God's plan for love is going to make life smooth. No, life's going to have its ups and downs. It's going to have its problems. But I don't know, what does he mean by the uninterrupted? So the truth is interruptions are real life. Just like life is not going to be a smooth, plain path. You're going to have problems. And God uses those trials, those problems to sanctify. That's where I went with it.
Yeah. And we'll be quick on this point. I really don't have an issue here.
Mm-hmm.
So you've heard us talk about, what I put in my notes ad nauseum. We have talked about the role of trials in the spiritual life over and over and over and over. I do think to have a genuine, thriving life, we have to retrain our natural affections to difficulty. Naturally, we think difficulty is bad. We want to get away from it. Spiritually, it's the complete opposite. You have to embrace difficulty. I have no problems. I like that thought. So moving on to number 3. Holding on to past hurts, regrets, or traumas can hinder your ability to move forward and grow. And here's the quote. Getting over a painful experience is much like crossing monkey bars. You have to let go at some point in order to move forward. So the picture that Lewis is, you're hanging on monkey bars. It's on the playground.
Sure.
And you're hanging onto the bar. And if you really want to move forward, you want to get across it, you have to let go of the one you're on to grab the next one.
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts there?
I mean, I think there's some biblical wisdom here. Doc O just wrote his book, A New Normal. And as trials, as problems arrive in one's life, you may just have to embrace, like, what was my life, what was normal will never be normal again. And there's a new normal. So sometimes that is the way that things are. So I'm not sure about his quote, but I mean, I can see how this could be a consistent biblical principle.
Yeah, and looking at the article itself, I definitely think what's strong about this is the quote is so quotable. Like monkey bars, you got to let go of one to get to the next. That's the best thing about the point. Remember that for later. When he talks about letting go of emotional baggage from painful experiences, what is he exactly referring to? The author of the article here. Is it forgiving people? Is it letting pain go? Is it trying to learn to move on? I think all of those could fit there. I think that's practically wise for sure. Mm-hmm. And really, I think, that's something that's really easy to say. It's much harder to accomplish in reality. But I like the thought. Well, we'll come back to it in a moment. But
it'd be nice. I wish Andy was here to critique, especially this one, because it sounds a little psychobabblish. Like later on, he makes a statement, letting go of the emotional baggage from painful experiences is essential to build mental resilience, progress, and finding healing and happiness. And this whole finding healing and that terminology and everything sounds like a lot of psychobabble. It would be nice if we would use biblical words to communicate biblical truth and how to deal with suffering. And Andy would be really good at interacting with that post. Yeah.
And I agree where that one, we'll just put an asterisk by it. It almost seems too good to be true, right? Okay, so number 4, don't miss an opportunity to learn from people smarter than you.
Which is why everybody should be listening to our podcast.
And should have a little group of friends to talk about books.
Exactly.
Yep. Don't miss out. Anyway, here's the quote from Lewis. The next best thing to being wise is to live in a circle of those who are.
That sounds like Lewis and his brotherhood and friendship
exactly. And this is what I wrote down. Sounds like a plug for a Thinklings group.
Boom.
So I love that one. Mm-hmm. No issues there. He's spot on. Number 5, solitude, silence, and privacy are not luxuries.
Sounds like certillage.
Here's the quote from Lewis. We live, in fact, in a world starved for solitude, silence, and private, and therefore starved for meditation and true friendship. And again, I do think we live in a culture where we're too busy, we're too distracted.
Too public.
I would go to, like, social media it's a mess. It's a mess of things. And so, again, I think this is a very Lewis-y thing to say. And I think if you catch it on the intricacies of the article, this is a nice balance to the first point. Where he's like, go live your life. And then number 5, he's like, but come back and be quiet and read books. So we critiqued him earlier for like kind of whiffing, and he like self-corrected. I don't know if he realized he did that. But he self-corrected. Yes, live your life, but also be still. Stillness is good. And so that was my thought on number 5. I just have 2 overall thoughts on the whole thing. But what do you? If
overall, I thought it was decent.
Overall, I like the thoughts. It's a simple little like nice thing to read, but there are some issues here. So number one, what I would say is probably the best Lewis quote, which is the monkey bars one, is almost definitely not C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
So if you can look it up, you have to pay to read it. But Christianity Today has an article that's like top quotes that are considered to be C.S. Lewis that actually aren't. And this is in that list, the monkey bars quote.
Really?
Yep. And that leads to my second issue. None of these quotations or the context thereof are mentioned by the writer of the article.
Right.
So you have no idea what Lewis was actually saying. You don't even know where to look if you want to read them from Lewis himself. What it seems to be is that he grabbed some catchy quotes and wrote some quick thoughts about them and wanted to throw C.S. Lewis in his title because he knew he'd get clicks.
Winner, winner, chicken dinner, man. That's what it's all about.
Yep. And, if I wanted to actually go to,
I don't know. That's a little cynical. But
on point number 4, it's better to, if you're not wise, it's better to have friends who are. Well, I'm not Lewis, but let me grab some quotes from him. And so all that to say, if I wanted to actually go to the one who says this is how to live the good life, I can't. You've chopped the tree at the roots.
It's a blog post.
It is. But not even to mention the books they're coming from. Not even like there's no locations, there's no titles, there's nothing. That to me is the most egregious of the fouls here. Is that like none of the quotes are attributed. Like not a title, not a page, not a whiff of where they actually come from. And I maybe missed that. I went to read the comments on the article to see if I could find it, and that's where I was tipped off pretty heavily that some of these quotes probably aren't Lewis. Overall, all of this falls under the umbrella of practical wisdom, right? And God's word teaches all of these principles in a much better way. But as an article telling me these are C.S. Lewis's 5 cardinal rules.
Yeah, that's a bit of an overstatement. 5 cardinal rules.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of
That's a lot of author.
Yeah.
The author of the article actually is saying that that's not Lewis.
Yeah, and I would take issue with number 1. I don't think Lewis would say that in the context that this author's portraying it. Number 3, I don't think Lewis actually said.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with number 3 is I could see the idea probably in some of his books.
Sure. And I think the Bible teaches that clearly.
Sure.
Don't be bitter, forgive,
right?
Press on to the goal.
Right.
But anyway, so overall, like, is it something that you need to read? No, but it just reminds us, folks, have academic integrity. If you're going to quote somebody, tell me where you're quoting from.
Where you got it from.
Tell me what you're quoting. This actually bothered me about one of the things I talk about in a class. Go right back to 2 Corinthians. There was a commentary that referred to 2 Corinthians 2-7 as the Great Digression. And I just remembered reading it in study, and I was like, that is such a great, like, fake title to what that is.
The Great Digression.
Because it seems like, not Lewis, Paul is talking about one thing, and he just goes on this huge tangent for like 5 chapters. And commentaries just struggle to figure out what's going on. And then one commentator's like, it's the Great Digression. And I used that for years. And then one time I'm like, I have no idea where that actually came from. And I tracked it down. And now in my classes, my students can attest to this. When I get to that PowerPoint slide about the Great Digression, I have a quote from the commentator, and it's footnoted at the bottom. And just like, if you're gonna say this is what somebody said, you got to show me where they said it. In a day of fake news, don't tell me someone said something without telling me where they said it. Anyway, so this is all as a response to Randy's email. Like, what do you think about this? With the ideas at face value, I don't really have an issue with them, with how the article is put together, how it's portraying C.S. Lewis. Have a few issues there. But if you want to look it up and read it for yourself, medium.com, 5 Cardinal Rules by C.S. Lewis, or from C.S. Lewis. Anyway, last thing we're going to do today, we have a final meditation in Exodus 32-ish.
I mean, I kind of already got into it a little bit in our listener feedback, but in Exodus 32, what do you have? You have a syncretistic religion where the Lord is included with the worship of some kind of idol. Israel was condemned repeatedly for this practice throughout their history. What was it often called?
Idolatry.
Idolatry, okay, right. But when they confused the worship of idols with the worship of the true God, what were they being, or what were they? It's too ambiguous.
You're false worshipers.
Okay, they
sinners.
committed spiritual adultery.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I should have gotten that. That's not that ambiguous. I should have got that.
That's all good. Okay, so as we think through the practice of syncretism, what it is it's a form of adultery. God desires spiritual adultery. God desires pure and holy worship, pure and holy relationship with his subjects. In the Old Testament, that would be the nation of Israel, and then in the New Testament, that's what God requires of the church. We see that same terminology even in the New Testament. So lest you think that that is simply an Old Testament thing, it is not. James rebukes the believers in James chapter 4, verse 4. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think that the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? But he gives more grace, therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The principle established in the Old Testament, continuing into the New Testament, is that God is a jealous God. We live in a culture that does not like jealousy. That exclusivity, however, is a righteous and a good thing. The jealous relationship between God and his subject is also a good thing. I was talking to some students even today as we began a discussion about worldliness, thinking through 1 John chapter 2 and the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. These are things that are of the world. The world passes away, but our Lord and the things that are eternal endure forever. We as believers need to worship the Lord in spirit and in truth, in exclusivity, in the manner in which he desires. So this whole idea of adultery and fidelity, present in the Old and continuing in the New, is something I'll probably talk about on a future episode. I think that there is a component of faithfulness that's related to the idea of adultery and spiritual adultery that might shed some light upon why our children abandon the faith after us. And we should ask ourselves, why is it that our children abandon the faith? Are we worldly Christians? Are we committing spiritual adultery with the world? And when our children see that, what happens? They're gone. So think about that, and that's something that I'm still thinking through. But look at your life and identify any worldliness that may be there and live a life that's wholly devoted to the Lord.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinklings podcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, suggestions, or potential topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can contact us through our email, thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. Remember, don't let this conversation end with this podcast. Read good books, talk about them with your friends, and always continue to cultivate your mind. See you next time on the Thinklings podcast. The Thinklings want to remind our listeners that the Thinklings podcast is our personal production. Our conversations, book discussions, and viewpoints may not represent the views of Faith Baptist Bible College and Theological Seminary. Any questions or feedback should be directed to us at the Thinklings podcast.